goal of today's hour is to explore what the pandemic means for the future of democratic institutions across the world. What can we learn from previous global emergencies? What can be done to strengthen democratic norms in a time when democratic norms seem to be a bit on the back foot? Other very, very weighty questions for which the Atlantic and our partners specialize. We're going to dive into all this soon. Before I do, I just want to remind everyone that you can be part of this conversation. You could type your questions in the Q&A box, which is on the bottom of your screen. Keep your questions in the form of questions. That's always very useful. Keep them short, on topic. You might want to direct them to one of the people in particular in our first segment. And we have a global audience today because we're a very globalist, I guess. And so we'd love to know where you're from. So put that in your question as well. I want to go now to our first two guests who, as luck would have it, are both Atlantic writers. Go figure. Anne Applebaum, of course, is a staff writer, Pulitzer Prize winner for the Atlantic, specialist in many things, including and especially the history and consequences of totalitarianism, authoritarianism. And we have Yascha Mounk, who is a contributing writer for our magazine and does many, many things. He's an associate professor at Johns Hopkins, at SAIS, the School for Advanced International Studies. He's with the German Marshall Fund. He's very, very busy at many, many think tanks doing very, very heavy thinking. They're both very well known in their fields. Let's jump right in. They also know each other fairly well, so feel free to cut each other off. I don't think either one of you will be offended by that. Anne, I always wanted to say, give us the view from Poland, and I could say that because you're actually in Poland. What are the Polish people thinking today about the future of democracy? And let's start with you. I just said in a kind of almost, it's a reflex to say this now, but that democracy is on the back foot. It was on the back foot before the pandemic. I guess the question is, how much more on the back foot is it as a global movement right now? And Yascha, you can jump in on that question as well.
So thanks, Jeff, for that introduction that reminded everyone that I'm in fact in Poland. It's true. One of the oddities of this pandemic is that, although all of us would like to keep talking about the world in the same way we were talking about it 6 months ago, is that actually the pandemic has divided nations in a different way from might have been expected. In other words, what you see when you look around the world right now is not a kind of democracy versus autocracy division, whereby, we're all talking about the democracies doing well or badly, or the dictatorships doing well or badly. What you're seeing is a division between countries that have a lot of public trust and that have bureaucracies and civic and public institutions that function well. And that means that countries like Taiwan or South Korea, or it increasingly appears Germany or Slovakia, turn out to be countries that are doing pretty well in the crisis, and their democratically elected leaderships are also doing well, and I think will, in the long term benefit. On the other side, we have other democracies like the United States, and to some extent Great Britain, and one or two others, which are not doing so well and have failed to cope with the pandemic because their politics are very polarizing, because they don't create cultures of trust where people are willing to cooperate for the sake of the whole society and so on. And so and then actually autocracies divide in a similar way. Some are doing better, some are doing worse, depending on how well they function. In fact, most of them are functioning rather badly. So, one of the, I think, things that's going to come out of this is not so much that, democracy is up or democracy is down, but that certain kinds of democracy and certain kinds of democratic leaders and certain forms of particularly of democratic, certain kinds of democratic states turn out to be better at dealing with this kind of crisis than others, and they will in turn engender, I think, greater trust and support as this goes on. And so whereas you might see in the US, you may see further breakdown, you may see further mood swing against democracy. In Germany or in Slovakia, you might see the opposite. I'll say that with just one caveat, which is that if you look back in history, every time there's been a plague or a pandemic, they always create cult movements, kind of political splintering, forms of madness, forms of insane religiosity. And this one is no exception. And we see, really actually in every country, you see the beginnings of little splinter movements and groups and conspiracy theorists. And they're the 5G ones and the, and the Chinese ones. And there are lots and lots of different people believing different things, including previously quite sensible people.
I thought you were just describing the White House. I'm sorry. I didn't realize that. I didn't realize it was bigger than that.
Yeah, there's the White House. Here I have a group of quite normally sober friends who've been sending me 5G conspiracy theories. Have you heard this? And do you realize that? And I was just talking to a friend in London who's had the same experience, that people are coming out of the woodwork. In a way, people are sort of driven insane by the loss of normality. And you may see a lot of weird splintering and fringe stuff developing, which also affects politics.
Yeah. Yasha, I want you to take Anne's answer and run with it, but also do one other thing if you can. As an inside outsider, you're a German, but you're in the U.S., studying the U.S., teaching in the U.S. You're actually in the cradle of democracy right now in Virginia, in fact. It looks like you're in the basement of Mount Vernon, in fact. Talk about your reaction to how our democratic system is working right now. And are you as surprised as other Germans, and I've been reading a little bit of the press there, at the befuddled, let's be fair about, the befuddled American response to the pandemic? And what does it say about the health of American democracy? I just loaded a lot onto your plate. Try to deal with it efficiently if you can.
I'll answer all the questions in 20 seconds.
Please.
Look, I have been. I've lived in the United States for about 12 years now. I'm a proud American citizen. I feel very at home here. And in those 12 years, I often spoke to people who grew up in Germany, who were German, and they said, I miss so many things about Germany. I miss the bread and the trains and whatnot. And, while I like German bread too, and while I certainly can get frustrated, with the Amtrak, I never had this sort of visceral feeling of what Germans call Heimweh, this sort of longing for home. Actually, the first time that I felt some version of it has been over the last weeks and months, because looking at the far from perfect, the in some ways too slow, at certain points chaotic German response, when nevertheless there was clear leadership that's trying to be unifying. There's a national plan. They're actually putting in place a testing and tracing regime at the federal level. And there's some hope that the country is now opening up in a rational way. Whereas in the United States, you've seen complete chaos, complete abnegation of responsibility at the top. And yes, an amazing amount of failure of state capacity. There was a global health survey a year or two ago where researchers tried to place countries by their capacity to dealing with a global health emergency. The United States came out top. Well, I think that was a mistake. Clearly, all of that state capacity we have on paper, all the great talent we have in the CDC and other institutions cannot be mobilized in a crisis, at least when we have an administration like we have right now, but perhaps those failings go deeper. I think it's actually plausible to fear that. Now, I do want to say something about the state of democracy around the world. I think Anne spoke very well, mostly about sort of which democracies dealt with the virus well and which didn't. And I think she's right that that's going to have an impact on democracy success. If we see in this moment that autocratic countries really succeed and democracies all fail, that would have a very long-lasting negative impact on the state of democracy. Thankfully, as Anne emphasized, that's not the case. But I think there's another way of thinking about it, which is what is the impact of this virus going to be on different democratic systems? And I think, roughly speaking, there's sort of three quick observations. One is that in countries where authoritarian populists were already gaining more and more power, this is really their moment to concentrate power in their own hands and obliterate the opposition. That's happened in Hungary, it's happening in the Philippines, as Anne will tell you, I think it's happening to a significant degree in Poland as well. So we'll see a whole bunch of countries being lost to democracy in the short and medium run, in part because of COVID-19 as a kind of moment where authoritarians can exploit this. I mean, the second thing is that there is a way in which the basic narrative of right-wing populists has been vindicated better than I could have dreamt up 3 months ago. The basic narrative seems, at least, to hold true. I don't actually ultimately believe it, that the world is a very dangerous place. We need very radical action to protect people. We need to close down borders. We need to get rid of globalization, all of those things. And I think that is going to have an overhang. It will make some of those far-right populist arguments sound more plausible to many people. Now, on the other hand, I also think there's a real countervailing factor, and I'm hoping that that will ultimately be the most significant. And that's what you're seeing, that those very people who in some ways have a narrative that seems to fit the moment, who promise to protect their populations from great dangers around the world, are utterly, miserably failing. But Donald Trump and Jair Bolsonaro, and by the way, AMLO in Mexico, and all kinds of other populists, most on the right, some on the left, are not capable of decent, sensible, competent governance of a form that actually saves lives right now. And I think the sort of warnings that people like Anne and I have made about populism for a very long time, saying, hey, be careful, this kind of lack of respect for expertise, lack of respect for independent institutions, that's going to affect your life. That seemed very abstract 6 months ago. It unfortunately does not seem so abstract now.
Well, let me ask both of you this question, jumping off that. I mean, you're describing a pattern in which, if you're looking at reality in Brazil, in the US, for instance, you'd say, oh, well, the populists should be on the back foot because they're not managing this great challenge well. On the other hand, the nature of populist rulers is to figure out ways to manipulate people to believe something that isn't true. So, I mean, I guess the question is, how much reality do the people of the United States need? How much reality do the people of Mexico or Brazil need? I use reality in a very loaded way. How much bad reality do they need before they go, oh, you know what? This isn't working.
Yeah, it's a very good point. I mean, a friend of mine described 2020 as the year that reality reemerges, and takes revenge on 2016. And when people see that actually you can die from something and it's not just, a hoax that's been dreamt up by CNN I mean, look, I think a lot, this is going to be an annoying answer, but a lot is going to depend on what happens. A lot depends on.
This is why we pay you the moderately big bucks.
That's right. No, a lot depends on how many people do get sick, how well your local hospital copes, the kinds of personal experiences that people have with the disease itself. At the point where it's just a purely theoretical, I mean, I am in the middle of nowhere in the Polish countryside, and no one around me is sick. And here there is a feeling of unreality. They're talking about something in Warsaw and none of us can really feel it or touch it. And why should we really care about it? And I can hear people around me talking like that. And so in that sense, I have some understanding of what people in West Texas, or rural Montana must feel like right now, that it's this theoretical thing happening in New York, or on TV. And therefore, why do we take it seriously? The progress of the disease and then the way in which people cope with it in particular communities is going to have a lot of impact on how people, on how people cope with it. I mean, if it somehow burns out, I mean, if it goes away magically by April, maybe not, but if we hit a number by which it's not reproducing quickly and it starts to fade away, then lots of people will say, well, what was that all about? It was a hoax and so on. And so the way in which individuals encounter the disease, the way in which they see it affecting their friends and families, the way they hear and see local hospitals, I mean, and all of that is kind of still to come. We're at the really very beginning of this, crisis. We're at the moment when it's hit major cities and places that are, close to big international airports. And we haven't gotten to the part of the crisis where it begins to really infect rural communities and spread like that. And that's at the moment when we'll learn, actually, do people what's real to people. Is what's real the thing that's on your phone or on your Facebook page, or is what's real, your cousin going to the hospital? And I actually don't know the answer. We'll find out.
To bastardize a much more elegant saying.
Doesn't it have some of it to do with the power of the individual authoritarian-minded leader to manipulate people? The verbal power, the manipulative power?
Yeah, I mean, I think that's why I have very different projections about the trajectory of people who are already very entrenched in power and those who are not. I mean, if you already have enough control of a political system that, like Viktor Orban in Hungary, you can say, I'm abolishing the parliament for the time being, I have a right to rule by decree. If you criticize me on social media, or to put it in the official language, if you spread false rumors on social media, you are going to be arrested and you might go to jail. And by the way, most of the media already are singing in tune with the government hymn sheet. Then you probably can control a lot of a narrative, and you reinforce your capture of a political system. I think in a place like the United States, or in a place like Brazil, where there's certainly authoritarian erosions going on, but there is still a very vibrant press, there are still some independent institutions, that's much less likely. Look, to bastardize a much more elegant saying, some people might deny reality all of the time. A lot of people might deny reality some of the time, but I don't think you can get a lot of people to deny reality all of the time. And I think, as Anne was saying, reality is going to hit home today. Now, not for everybody, but that's not necessary, right? When you think of something like the election we have coming up in the United States, is there going to be 20, 25% of the population, probably more, that's going to remain fervently convinced that Donald Trump is their savior and he's the only person who can actually protect them? Absolutely. But he will need a lot more than that in order to eke out a victory. And when I look at some of his slogans at the moment, I'm struck by how weak they are. I mean, what he's been tweeting for the last days is transition to greatness, exclamation mark. That reminds me of Selina Meyer, or perhaps of jab, exclamation mark. It does not remind me of a very effective rhetorically campaign of 2016. So how do you sell, I'm going to make America great again 4 years ago. He was going to say, I've made America great. Well, that's really tone deaf at the moment. So now he's reduced to transition to greatness. That's not a very selling message to the people he needs to win.
Yeah, that reminds me actually of the communists used to always talk about, well, we've reached the fourth stage before communism, and we still have to just keep trying until we get to the next stage. It's a very poor authoritarian tactic. Keep telling people, well, we're not there yet. You just need to believe harder or try harder. I mean, I would say the other danger in the U.S. is actually there is a weird similarity between the U.S. and here, where I'm in Poland, which is that when you have very polarized societies, there is a way in which the virus and reaction to the virus may divide people further. Yash, you were talking about how certain kinds of authoritarians will be entrenched further. There's also the possibility that polarized societies will be polarized further. In the US, you will have a kind of reality community that listens to doctors, and then you'll have an unreality community that listens to conspiracy theories on Facebook. And you have something like that here as well, where the divisions between people that opened up over the last several years have just grown larger, and people are farther away from this. So the way in which the virus can make, it almost acts like an X-ray. Whatever is wrong with your society, it kind of emphasizes it or makes it worse. And conversely, in societies where things do work rather well, as we've talked about Germany, but there are others. It may show people that, they have a lot of solidarity and social trust and so on. It may be a reinforcement of democracy.
But I want to go, thank you, Anne. I want to go to one or two questions from our audience. By the way, transition to greatness is my slogan for when I decide to wear actual pants rather than sweatpants. That's my transition to greatness every day. There's a question from Gasper. How do you repair the mythic narrative of America, the deep beliefs that make a we the people democracy possible? It's a very good question. It's about e pluribus unum. We don't feel, in a slightly different context, Jim Mattis used to say that Americans have lost affection for one another, and that is a national security threat greater than any other individual national security threat. How do you repair a fractured, let's talk about America. You can talk about other countries as well if you want, but how do you make people believe they're part of the same narrative, and that their identities and that their futures are tied up one with another?
Well, I'm actually optimistic about that in reality, even if not in the abstract, which is to say that when you ask people how united are we, when you ask people, how much do we have in common, you get varying answers. So actually, some recent polls say that a large majority of the country thinks that we have more in common than what divides us. And by the way, those numbers are even higher among Latinos and African Americans than among whites. The group among which the feeling that we have something in common is untrue, is actually the ones who are perhaps most likely to be Atlantic readers, which is to say highly educated, left-leaning people. So actually, I think the country thinks we have something in common.
We have all kinds of people, Yasha, but I go ahead.
Well, that's absolutely. But I also think that, when you look at how people interact in the real world, not on Twitter, not when there's a political campaign, there is a natural way in which a pluribus unum is still true. There is a unified American culture, and perhaps it takes an immigrant to notice that. For all of the wonderful diversity of this country, walking into a bar or a restaurant or a Starbucks or a public space or a government office in the United States feels very different from Britain, very different from Germany, and as Anne will tell you, I'm sure, very different from Poland. There is a natural script for how people interact. And by the way, when the Olympics are on, somebody in the northern part of Michigan, who's a couple of miles away from Canada, is going to cheer for the guy from Los Angeles who's really far away from him, who may have a different ethnicity, different religion, but they're both American, and he wants that guy to win over the person who may have grown up 5 miles to the north across the Canadian border. I think there is a strong sense of a pluribus unum, and as intellectuals, we sometimes lose sight of that.
Right. Anne, I want you to answer that, but let me throw in one more question, our final question. Maybe you can grapple with both of them. Deb Bitton asks, social media has given equal standing to lies in opposition to what used to be trusted sources of news and information. How can democracy survive with no accepted version of the truth, in scare quotes?
So funny you should ask that, but it's something I've been thinking about a lot. I mean, we're at the beginning of this information revolution, and we're at a stage that you can compare it to the invention of the printing press, which was also a moment of great political chaos and change. And we're still learning how to use it and how to think about new ways of confirming and basically persuading people to read and understand and grow closer to facts rather than accepting disinformation. We haven't yet thought much as a society about, first of all, how we might eventually begin to regulate social media. And this is a big topic, and there are a lot of different ways we could go into it. Probably not enough time to do so on this one chat. Because we certainly regulated the press, in the olden days, and we certainly regulated radio and television. There were licenses, there were libel laws, there were other tools that we used to add more reality and less fiction and less slander to the media. And we also haven't yet thought very much about, do we want there to be some kind of public service social media? So is there some equivalent of the BBC that you could create online? That also, and this is also partly the answer to the previous question, are there themes you could talk about? Are there ways you could discuss things, that could be acceptable to different political groups? I mean, maybe you'd have to choose subjects carefully, but are there, is there a 21st century equivalent to that, to kind of public service information, even just to have available as a choice? I'm not saying it should be the only thing you can find online. But we haven't yet thought much about what are the new channels of information, because one of the things that we've learned about combating disinformation is that a lot of things we imagined would work, like fact checking and so on, don't really work. And what's needed instead is forms of information that create trust and that build communities around sources of trust. And it may be that we just need to think harder about how to do that on social media. So,
what does that look like in practical terms?
So call me in about a year and I'll tell you. This is one of the things that I want to do. But as I said, try to imagine, the BBC or something like the BBC online. In other words, a source of information that is designed to reach people, of different age groups in different parts of the country, using different channels, that seeks to build trust in different kinds of communities, that creates content or news or information or documentaries or programs that are designed to do exactly what Yasha was talking about a second ago, which is to build unity. I mean, it's, as I said, these are questions that have been grappled with before. They were grappled with at the beginning of the broadcast revolution. So maybe it's something that we could begin to do in the next year or two.
Thank you, Anne. One final, very, very quick question for Yasha. Germany is a different experience, obviously coming out of World War II, than America in terms of untrammeled free speech, right? You can't be a Nazi in Germany. It's illegal. Do you think that in order to defend democracy, the idea of democracy, we have to impose German level strictures on the way people express themselves?
I don't know, for a couple of reasons. The first is that there's lots of countries with restricted free speech in which populists have taken over in terrifying ways, including Turkey and India and many others around the world. And the second of which is that I think people always make the wrong argument for freedom of speech. They talk about all the wonderful things that will flow from freedom of speech, all the wonderful debates and the way we'll learn from each other and we might correct our opinion and so on. And those are all important. They don't pay enough attention to the negative things that flow from giving some people control over our speech. And I think one of them is that they actually make elections more totalizing. But if I fear that if you win the election, I'm not going to be able to say what I want afterwards, I have all the more reason to just go all out and play dirty as much as I can. And the second is that we just simply have no reason to trust that the right decisions are always going to be taken. Right now, it might be that the government outlaws opinions I don't like, but as soon as a populist is in power, and that's now a realistic prospect in every democracy in the world, those same laws can be used in order to shut up the people who are rightly criticizing those populists. So I think we have to defend freedom of speech, and we can very well defend democracy, even when very unpleasant people get to say very unpleasant things.
Yasha, thank you very, very much. Anne, thank you very, very much. It's great to see you both in 2D. Hope to see you in 3D at some point in the near future. Thanks very much for joining us. I want to switch now over to our next guest, Martha Minow, who is an esteemed Harvard law professor, former dean of Harvard Law School, professor, mentor to many. I love the background, Martha. I really do. It fills me with joy. Mentor to many esteemed individuals, including Barack Obama when he was at Harvard Law School. In the interest of full disclosure, Martha and I have known each other for some time. We served on a nonprofit board together. Among her many attributes is that no one runs a tighter meeting than Martha Minow. That is absolutely true. Now that I run meetings, I know that for sure. Martha, thanks for joining us. I guess. Yeah. How's it? You're dressed very strangely for Anguilla. That's all I can say. Jumping off that conversation, I'd love to hear your own view of the state of democracy, or let me hone in a little bit more, the fragility of democracy. Talk about it in the American domestic context. You know, we're almost a 250-year-old democracy. We had some bad moments. The Civil War comes to mind as a bad moment, clarifying moment also. But we've been pretty stable in our adherence to democratic norms, and we're going to talk about the judiciary and independence of the judiciary in a minute. But it does seem newly fragile, and it does seem the pandemic, I think Anne said, it's kind of like an X-ray where it helps you see right through things in a kind of way. Are you worried about the long-term health of American democracy?
I'm deeply worried, and frankly, I was worried before the pandemic, and this only exacerbates the challenges, which include lack of investment in our civic institutions, lack of investment in civic education, something that has actually been cut back for 3 or 4 decades in this country. Federal government cut back about 10 years ago, but all the states have really displaced it. So that at this moment in the United States, 60% of Americans cannot name 3 branches of government. 20% can't even name 1 branch of government. There's just a lack of even understanding or knowledge about what the institutions are, much less why they are worth defending. I think that there's been divestment in the news industry, which your prior speakers were examining, and in the infrastructure to support them. The same way as there's lack of investment in the physical infrastructure of the United States, the bridges and the roads and so forth. And I think it's partly a reflection of a larger erosion of a view of the public good as something that we all are committed to. And instead, the language of the private has taken over.
Well, how did that happen?
Oh, I don't think it's by accident. I think that there's been a very considered campaign by many corporations and many wealthy people who funded think tanks. And so if you take, for example, the rise of the Federalist Society, which is just in my world of law, you know, it's a subgroup that was financed by a lot of outside groups, corporations and wealthy people, to support the development of a right-wing, libertarian-leaning, anti-regulation ideology for lawyers and judges. And right now, President Trump has outsourced the selection of the federal judiciary to this group. And that took 30, 40 years to develop a whole infrastructure.
Is there another democracy on the planet that has that a movement that argues what that movement argues for at that strength?
That's an awfully good question. I don't know of one. There are, of course, forces of reaction in many places, but this considered use of really the great features of our open society to actually take over, to have it take over. Some people have even said that there's been a corporate takeover of the First Amendment. Do you know that more than half of the First Amendment cases in court in the last 5 years have been ones brought by corporations claiming the First Amendment as a way to avoid regulation? That doesn't happen by accident, and there's no other country in the world where anything like that is happening.
Right. Let's bear down on this, because I'm fascinated by the idea, or by, I hate to admit it, but the relatively new idea that's crept into my head that that just because we've been doing this for a couple of centuries doesn't mean we're always going to be doing it. You know what I mean? I mean, the whole, and as you know, in my previous existence as a writer, spent a lot of time in the developing world and in non-democratic countries where the independence of the judiciary was not assumed, for good reason. But we both grew up in a country where the independence of the judiciary has been assumed. Do you assume it anymore?
I think it's very, very vulnerable, and it's vulnerable for at least 3 reasons. One is that it's under verbal attack at the highest levels, President Trump being the ringleader, really, of assaulting individual judges and the judiciary generally. Secondly, it's under assault in part because of the politicized process of judicial selection. At the federal level, we all have watched it. But at the state level, where about half the states elect their judges, there's also a politicization with campaign finance influencing it as well. And then the third reason, frankly, is the lack of access to the courts for many, many people, middle-class people, poor people, so that the experiences that people have with justice are not ones always that build confidence.
Right. Talk about another branch of government, the legislature. And the reason I ask this is, if you are a critic of Donald Trump, or let's put it this way, many sophisticated critics of Donald Trump understand that, this is their frame, Trump is not the actual issue, that Trump can't exist without the acquiescence of a party structure, dozens to hundreds of elected officials of his party. And so widening that optic a little bit, talk about the role Congress now plays in oversight of the executive branch. Because it seems to be like a withering, some people are allowing a power that's given to them to wither.
it of course takes two to tango, because if you have now the House trying to do oversight and you have the administration refusing to participate, the president and the White House ordering White House officials not to participate, it's very hard to do oversight. But I agree with you that we've seen this with the Senate. There's a kind of capitulation and a failure to perform a critical set of roles. You know, it's called separation of branches in the common language, but actually our Constitution, which is the oldest continuously in use written constitution for a nation in the world, it doesn't call for separating the branches. They're marbled together. The powers are intertwined. They depend on mutual checking. And if one part falls down, that has tremendous consequences for whether or not this whole machine will work. And right now it's not working very well.
From your perspective, how bad can it get?
Well, I will say, I am comforted by the way the founding fathers did create lots of speed bumps, as it were. So rapid change in the system as a whole is hard, but it could get very bad. So just as an example, federalism, the decentralization of power to the states, is a very important speed bump. There are many activities that the federal government doesn't do, can't do. But when we come to something like the pandemic and it's left to the states and the localities, which are not capable of orchestrating a national market for ventilators or a national scheme for contact tracing, that exposes a weakness that then corrodes respect for the governments up and down, like local, state, and federal. And when there's lack of confidence, when people don't vote or they're cynical about it, when the voting system itself is not reliable, the democracy is in real serious trouble.
Talk about the voting system. How worried are you about that coming up to this election?
Well, I'm deeply worried. The issues of voter suppression have been real. I will say that there's been progress in the last 4 years on the presence of a paper ballot or backup. If we were worried before that the use of machines was actually producing a system that wasn't accountable, the problem now is that we may have many elections that are run without live polls, without actual going to the polls, or as we saw in Wisconsin, people actually having to put in jeopardy their own health and well-being to do so. If we don't put in place a reliable system of mail voting, there will be many people who won't be able to vote. And if it's politicized, if it's viewed as it is already being discussed as, oh, that's for one party, that's for the Democrats, that will erode any kind of confidence in the result. Just as a footnote, the evidence is pretty clear that voting by mail has no party benefit. It's benefited Republicans at times and it's benefited Democrats at times. But look, I'm worried, you know, there's a risk that we won't have a fall election this year, or that if we do have one, that whoever wins or loses, if it's a name that begins with T, there won't be respect given to the results. I'm genuinely worried in a way I never have been in my entire life. I hope I'm wrong. I do believe that there are many, many forces of response, but one of your prior questions exposes why I'm worried. Where are the states people in the Republican Party standing up for the integrity of the system, the electoral system? Don't they care about it? I haven't heard them.
I want to ask another question on a subject that you've written a lot about, forgiveness, which comes into play in various ways in this pandemic. But let me go to a question from somebody in our audience, Jose de la Torre, who asks, is some form of national service from our youth the answer to the decline of democratic values in our country?
Well, I love this question. So thank you, Jose, for that. I think that national service is one of the ways to strengthen that sense of we and common enterprise that you were talking about in the prior segment. And I don't think it's by accident that it's the great generation after World War II, when there was a very large participation in the military, that people came back and had a sense of civic responsibility, not only because they had fought in wars, but because they had built bonds with people from across the country doing something together. So I'm myself a big supporter of national service, and a commission on that subject was created under President Obama, but it finished under President Trump and came out with a recommendation for national service. I think it would be a good move for people who are from privileged suburbs and from people who are from decimated areas and in urban areas, for them to have a chance to work together, learn together, serve the country, and no doubt have a greater sense of their own capacities to make a change. Look, my biggest source of hope is young people. I think that the hope in the country, maybe in the world, is the next generation who already show so much resilience and capacity and creativity and less polarization.
Come to this question quickly. We'll do one more question after this from the audience, but come to this question of forgiveness. You've written a lot about this. I wanted to ask you, maybe standing on one foot, define what your concern is, or define what the issue is, and then deal with this question. People are going to be drowning in debt soon. We already know pre-pandemic, we know that students were drowning in a kind of debt that not only shackled them to jobs they necessarily didn't want, but just shackled them mentally, emotionally. Do you think we're going to be looking at a reinvigoration of a debate around broad-scale debt forgiveness?
So thank you for this. Yeah, I've been thinking for some time now about forgiveness, and by that I mean letting go of a justified grievance. And I think that there's a lot to learn historically, as societies around the world have actually entertained and adopted society-wide forgiveness. You know, you just think about the Bible's use of the Jubilee as an example, kind of a reset moment. And it was specifically around debt, as well as crime and enslavement. And we have a Jubilee movement that was led in part by the Pope and also by Bono and others, trying to collectively develop a capacity to forgive developing countries' debt. And I think that there's great resonance across every tradition, every religious, philosophic tradition. Every nation has developed some notion about interpersonal forgiveness. And so, yes, I think bankruptcy is built into our Constitution as a way to allow individuals and companies to have a fresh start. When it comes to the debt situation right now, students and tenants and mortgagees and so forth, I think we have this emergency that has led to kind of surprising but nimble responses of suspending required payments. But something terrible is going to happen when those suspensions end and the balloon payments hit. People will not have the money to pay off their student debt that has accumulated over 3 months, 4 months, 5 months, or their rent, or their mortgage payments. And I think that we need forgiveness. And I hope and believe that we will have national and statewide conversations about that. It would be better for everyone. The people who've studied the Great Depression, the period after the 30s in this country, find that those states that had debt forgiveness recovered much better and much more quickly than those that did not. And we should take a page. We should learn from that lesson.
One final question from our audience for you, Gary Jackson. Is there a danger that the Supreme Court will evolve into a more political branch of government under either political party?
That is a huge danger. And when you have basically people, commentators, the president, others talking about Republican judges and Democratic judges, it's bad for democracy. It's bad for all of us. It means that there's not respect for judgments. I think that Chief Justice currently in the United States understands this very well And he rebutted the president of the United States and said, no, we don't have Republican judges and Democratic judges. It's a major concern.
You think
And
he was on the level when he said that?
I'm sorry?
You think he was on the level when he said that?
I think he believes that.
He
Yes.
believes that? Okay.
I think he believes that. I think that the Chief Justice does believe in the rule of law. I think that it's very tough to navigate on the Supreme Court right now because there is a solid majority that leans in one direction. And that makes it very hard to signify and signal that there are decisions that aren't just always 5-4, 5-4, 5-4.
Martha, we can go on all day, but we can't. It's always enjoyable to talk to you. I just want to recommend that you use sunscreen where you are, obviously. And thank you for your wisdom. Thank you for coming by our conversation. It's good to see you.
Let's look for hope. Let's look for sunny skies. Thank you, Jeff, for all you're doing.
Thank you. And now I'd like to turn to the interview that we recorded earlier this morning with Tony Blair, the former Prime Minister of the United Kingdom. I want to talk about some big themes, including the future of democracy. But let me ask you this, because you've been weighing in on this subject. The World Health Organization, President of the United States wants to cut off all funding permanently, or is threatening to the World Health Organization. Give us your view.
Well, right now you've got to support it. I mean, look at the work that we can see in Africa. The World Health Organization is absolutely vital in providing equipment, advice, making sure that those countries with very weak healthcare systems are able to do what they can to mitigate the effects of the crisis. So right now you've got to support it. Now, long term, by the way, it's clear that you need a complete recasting of the World Health Organization, its structure, its organization, how it manages its business more effectively. But the point is, at the moment, it's right to support it. And it's also, I think, unfair to criticize the people in it, because I know from my own experience, they're working flat out. But let's be clear, prior to this global pandemic, the last time I had major interaction with them was over the Ebola crisis, because my institute was in all of the countries, 3 to 4 countries affected by it. So we were working during that Ebola crisis with the World Health Organization. That was a tiny crisis, effectively, in a small part of West Africa. You're talking about a global pandemic. So it's like, I don't know what the right analogy is, but to say the World Health Organization, to criticize them at the moment is to criticize them for not being what no one ever thought they would have to deal with, something as large as this. So I think afterwards, there will be I think it should be a calm and sensible and measured analysis of what's necessary to put in place the global architecture for pandemic preparedness. But I don't see any point in attacking the WHO now.
Could you grade Donald Trump's performance during the pandemic?
No, because I've learned through a long political life that usually I have enough troubles in my own politics without trying to grade other people's performance. But
who do you like on the world scene?
So for me, the difference is, and without getting into individuals, but for me, the difference is the governments that have acted fast and efficiently. And so those governments that went swift to lockdown, took a measure of the problem, ramped up the testing, are now building the infrastructure of containment, because we're going to have to live with this disease, you see. I mean, we're not going to eliminate this disease in the near future. With a vaccine over time, maybe we can, but in the near term, we're going to be living with it. So you've got to build the containment infrastructure that gives people confidence to move the economy back, because the economic damage of this thing is immense and terrifying, actually. But we're not going to be able to deal with it unless you provide people with the confidence that government's on top of the issue. So, you look around the world and you see South Korea and Germany, and, there are small and large countries that have done well.
Right. The reason I ask that is not just to stimulate an interesting answer from you, but this goes to the question of democracy. Since the close of World War II, the United States, with its wingmen, not to be condescending, but with Great Britain right by its side, has stood for globalization defined however you want, the spread of democracy, standing for freedom and transparency, and so on. I feel now, as do others, that the United States has left its traditional position as a global leader behind. I'm wondering if you agree with that, if you think that China is filling that role, who will fill that role, and will it be a democracy? A lot of questions packed into that.
Right, well, there's certainly a perception in the world that America has disengaged. And there's certainly an attempt by China to move into that position and assume more of a global leadership role. But I still think there is an intrinsic force and strength in liberal democracy. And I think the challenge of democracy today, in my view, is efficacy. It's understanding why these populist movements have arisen and what is necessary to do to defeat them. And that populism, I think, derives in part from people's feelings that the system is unfair for large numbers of people, that it has not delivered for them over a period of time. Stagnant incomes post the financial crisis, even to a degree pre it, have played a huge part in this. And the reason why populists get support is the feeling that they will break up that system and move things. And I think we underestimate constantly the appeal. This kind of populist appeal is based on the notion that I'm faced with a brick wall and I'll punch my way through it, whereas these guys will just sit around and contemplate forever.
Right.
And that concept of efficacy is the challenge. And that's why, for me, we've also got to be self-critical from the progressive side of politics about what we have been doing wrong, right? Which I think you can be quite clear about, actually.
Right. Well, let me ask you this. What specific challenges are posed to democracy by the pandemic? What is the specific threat of the pandemic to the future of democracy? And I think we both probably agree that democracy feels like it's a little bit on the back foot these days.
Yeah, democracy is definitely on the back foot. There's a weakening of the institutions and the respect for the institutions. Social media is a revolutionary phenomenon in its own right. Politics becomes more and more partisan. And the question is whether out of this pandemic, whereas I say the governments who put a premium on competence, effectiveness, getting the job done and getting it done at speed, the question is whether out of this pandemic, people say, well, actually what you want are reasonable, evidence-based political leadership that will take the right decisions on a practical basis, or whether the economic damage out of this and the social damage is so great that you get a whole new politics emerging, which is even more populist than what we've had before. Because I think there's no doubt at all to my mind that economic damage out of this is going to be profound, and it will affect the poorest in our society most. So they're the ones that are missing the schooling. They're the ones whose jobs are going to go. They're the ones that are insecure in the workplace anyway. It's frankly the people like you and me who can exist in this world much more easily than they can. So I think, and I don't think that the public quite understands yet the depth of this economic problem that we're going to have.
Do you think that authoritarian governments bring any advantage to pandemic management?
I don't think they bring any advantage because they're authoritarian. I think speed of decision making, setting aside the normal rules of bureaucracy, are essential in these circumstances. But democracies can do that too. You don't have to be an authoritarian country to do that.
Right. Give me an example from UK history, US history of a democratic government managing a crisis of this scale competently and swiftly.
I mean, it's of this scale. I haven't come across one of this scale or of this nature. I mean, I had to deal when I was in government myself with probably the worst ever foot and mouth disease outbreak in the UK that any Western country had seen. So but this was trivial compared with what we've got on at the moment. Post-financial crisis, of course, that was a major problem. But I think you've got to really wind it back. Yeah. Probably.
I was thinking about the defeat of the Nazis as a good example.
Yeah. Right. So, okay, so there, the reason why Churchill came to power was because ultimately people felt that you needed a leader that was a democratic leader, but had the capability to just push his way through and get the job done. And he did that really by changing the whole structures of government. One of the things that I've actually been critical of my own government here is, though I'm sympathetic, obviously, to the scale of the problem they're facing, is if you want to deal with this pandemic, you've got to deal with it by repositioning and reorganizing government fundamentally. And that means bringing in new people. That means changing the normal rules and regulations that you operate under. And that means an absolute laser-like focus on what's necessary to get the job done. So, but there's no reason why democracies can't do that. The citizens in this instance will support them doing that. I think what is difficult with democracy more generally is when it's appeared in the face of a population that wants change to be simply managing a status quo that isn't working for a large number of people. Now, the left and the right then have their ideas about where they take that. So the right tends to go protectionist, anti-immigration, the left goes for a big state. And my view is that the single most important challenge that modern democracy faces is how to make sense of the technology revolution. It's the 21st century equivalent of the 19th century industrial revolution. I think out of this pandemic, by the way, technology, the need to utilize it will massively accelerate as a result of it. And the people who master that technology future and make it work for people, they're the people that will own the politics.
Right. Well, Mr. Prime Minister, we could talk all day, but you are, even though you're at home, you're a very busy man and have things to do, as does our audience. So I wanted to thank you very much for joining us and sharing your insights. So thanks very much. And thanks to all of our speakers for joining us today. Thank you to the Peterson Institute and Emerson Collective, Chatham House, and of course, my hardworking colleagues at The Atlantic for pulling this all together. We hope that our audience, and we're very thankful to you, we hope that you will come to theatlantic.com and subscribe to our magazine to get all of our excellent journalism. And we hope to see you at another Atlantic digital event very, very soon. Thank you very much.
Many thanks for joining us for The Way Forward, the Future of Democracy. Thank you to Churchill Capital Corp and Michael Klein for supporting our journalism throughout this series.